The morgue was the quietest place I had ever worked, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the type that pressed in on you, filling your ears until even your own breathing felt too loud. I was a second-year med student doing my clinical rotations. Part of my assignment involved shadowing Dr. Klein, a pathology instructor who doubled as the hospital's acting coroner. That afternoon, the building was mostly empty. The hospital's main halls still hummed with nurses, gurneys, and patient chatter. But our wing down a narrow corridor behind a locked, keypad-secured door was another world entirely. The morgue's cold-tiled walls and stainless steel counters reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic layered over something metallic. Dr. Klein and I were the only ones in the building. I knew this because he'd locked the front and side doors behind us after lunch, muttering about limiting interruptions. He was in the autopsy suite examining tissue samples, while I inventoried supplies in the storage area next to the freezer room. That was when the alarm went off. It wasn't a blaring fire alarm, more like an urgent, rapid beeping. But in that silence, it was deafening. The red light above the freezer door began flashing, and the little digital panel read, "Door open." My first thought was mechanical failure. But as I stepped closer, I realized the handle on the freezer door was slightly tilted, not fully latched. I froze, gripping the clipboard against my chest. The freezer only had one entrance, and no one had gone in since we'd arrived. From the autopsy suite, Dr. Klein called out, "Check it," in that clipped tone that was more command than request. I took a breath, moved to the door, and pressed it shut until it clicked. The alarm cut instantly, leaving only the hum of the refrigeration system. Inside, though, something bothered me. Stainless steel floor had faint marks, a couple of smudges, as if something heavy had been dragged across it recently. And then I remembered. Every single body in the morgue was supposed to be tagged, logged, and locked in place. Dr. Klein appeared beside me, looking more irritated than concerned. "Probably didn't latch all the way when I came in this morning," he muttered, but I couldn't shake the image of those smudges and the fact that the freezer alarm doesn't go off unless the door is physically opened from inside or out. Dr. Klein slipped on a pair of latex gloves, his jaw set tight. "Come on," he said, pulling the heavy latch. The blast of cold hit me immediately, a sharp bite that prickled my skin, even through my scrubs. The hum of the refrigeration was louder inside, echoing against the metallic racks. Each gurney-like tray held a white draped form, a paper tag tied to an ankle or wrist. I followed behind as Dr. Klein began moving down the row, checking tags against the clipboard he carried. His motions were practiced, almost bored until he reached the last rack on the left. The sheet there was bunched oddly, like it had been grabbed or pulled. The tag was still on the ankle, but the body was turned slightly off-center, one arm hanging unnaturally toward the floor. I felt that prickle of unease again, the same I'd felt when the alarm went off. Something about it wasn't right. "Looks fine," Dr. Klein muttered, straightening the sheet. But then he stopped, frowning at the gurney's locking mechanism. "That's strange. It's always secured. This one isn't." Before I could ask what that meant, a sharp clack echoed from the far corner of the freezer. We both turned. The sound had come from the lowest drawer and older storage compartment we hadn't touched yet. Dr. Klein crouched down, unlatching it. The rail screeched as he pulled the drawer open, but it was empty, completely empty. The log said it should have contained a body delivered 2 nights ago. Dr. Klein stood slowly, his face unreadable. "We'll deal with that later," he said, shutting the drawer with a bang. "Let's finish up." But as we stepped out and sealed the door again, I couldn't ignore the small, wet footprint in the freezer's entryway. It wasn't ours. The footprint was faint, already starting to bead with condensation from the warmer air outside the freezer, but it was enough to send a cold knot twisting in my stomach. It was barefoot. Dr. Klein saw it too, his eyes narrowing. He crouched, touched the edge of the damp print with his glove, then looked at me. "You didn't spill anything when you came in earlier, did you?" I shook my head. My mouth felt dry. "No, sir. I didn't even open the freezer before you got here." He straightened, scanning the tiled hallway beyond. The morgue was silent again, except for the low whine of the fluorescent lights. No other doors had opened, and I was certain we were still the only 2 people in the building. We followed the print. It led only a few feet out of the freezer room before smearing into nothing on the polished floor, like whoever or whatever had made it had simply stopped dripping. There were no more marks, no damp streaks, no sign of direction. Dr. Klein finally broke the silence. "I'm logging this as a mechanical malfunction," he said evenly, but his tone told me he didn't believe that. "We'll have to check the surveillance feed later. You go back to the office and stay there." I obeyed, but even from the office down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of the freezer alarm resetting, the latch clicking into place again. That night, I couldn't stop picturing the missing body from the logbook hand, wondering if the footprint had been the last trace of where it went. Dr. Klein didn't say much for the rest of the afternoon. He finished the paperwork in clipped silence, only pausing to check his watch or scribble something down in the logbook. Every time I caught his expression, it was the same tight, calculating, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. By the time we finally sat down to review the security footage, the building was empty except for us. The glow from the monitor painted the room in cold blue light, and I could hear the hum of the hard drive spinning up. The first hour of footage was normal to normal. The cameras showed the corridor outside the freezer door, empty and still. No movement, no shadows, no changes. Then, at 2:41 p.m., the alarm sounded in real time on the recording. The freezer door swung open. No one was there. It didn't look like it had been forced. The handle turned, the latch released, and the door opened slowly, like someone was pulling it from the inside. The frame stayed open for several seconds. Then, a faint ripple crossed the air near the doorway, as if heat was distorting the image, but the rest of the room was a scold. And then the barefoot print appeared clear as day on the floor outside the freezer. One moment it wasn't there, the next it was. No foot stepped into view. Dr. Klein leaned forward, freezing the frame. His jaw tightened. "There's nothing on the thermal overlay," he muttered, tapping a key. Whatever did that wasn't giving off heat. I didn't say a word, but my skin prickled. Because in that frame just at the edge of the camera's fisheye distortion, there was a faint outline of something hunched and human-shaped. Mid-step, moving out of the freezer and into the hall. Dr. Klein hit delete without a second thought. I came in the next day telling myself it was just fatigue from the long shift, maybe even some weird freezer malfunction, but the thought didn't stick. The corridor to the morgue felt heavier than usual. Dr. Klein was already there, but not in his usual lab coat. He wore a windbreaker, gloves, and a clipped tone. He didn't greet me, just told me the security system had been adjusted and that I'd be logging entries and exits manually for the day. We worked in silence for hours. No alarms, no odd sounds. It was almost boring until I went to grab a mop from the storage closet down the hall. The floor inside was wet. Not just damp from a leaky pipe wet, with distinct streaks of melted ice snaking from the corner toward the hallway. At the very end of the trail, right at the doorway, was another barefoot print. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just Dr. Klein messing with me, or some unlucky maintenance worker. But when I leaned closer, the size hit me. It wasn't an adult's print. It was small, child-sized. By the time I went back to the morgue to get Dr. Klein, the water had mostly dried. The print was faint now, barely visible, and the trail had vanished entirely. I tried to explain, but he didn't look surprised. He just gave me a hard glance and said, "Never leave the freezer unattended. No matter what you hear. Understand?" That night, I lay awake wondering how many times that alarm had gone off before I started working there, and how many times someone had answered it. It was a week later when the alarm went off again. I was alone this time. Dr. Klein had gone upstairs to meet with the hospital administrator. The sharp, rapid beeping ripped through the morgue silence, echoing off the tile. I felt my stomach knot instantly. The sound wasn't just loud, it was urgent, the kind of noise you have to respond to. I stood in the hallway staring at the freezer door. I remembered his warning. Never leave the freezer unattended. No matter what you hear. But this wasn't something I was hearing from inside. It was the alarm itself. Surely that was different. Still, I didn't move. My pulse thudded in my ears. The beeping continued for a solid 30 seconds before it, just like last time, it stopped. I exhaled. Then I froze again. From inside the freezer came the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal, slow, heavy, deliberate, like one of the storage drawers sliding out. My mouth went dry. Every instinct told me to leave the building. but instead I found myself edging closer to the door, my eyes fixed on the tiny window. The light inside was dim, but I thought I saw movement. Then, as I leaned in, something tapped on the glass. 3 times, soft, precise. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but I couldn't look away. The window was just opaque enough that I couldn't make out a face, only the faint suggestion of someone standing there. The scraping stopped. Silence. When Dr. Klein returned, I didn't mention it. He didn't ask why. I was pale and shaking. He just glanced at the freezer door as if he already knew. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe the real reason for his rule wasn't about not answering the noise, but about making sure whatever was inside never thought I might. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I shut my eyes, I heard those 3 soft taps on the glass, each one perfectly spaced, almost patient. By morning, I had convinced myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe even my nerves. But when I walked into the morgue for my next shift, the first thing I noticed was that the freezer door was slightly ajar. Only a fraction less than an inch, but enough for cold air to curl out in a faint mist across the floor. I stood there for a long time before stepping closer. Dr. Klein was nowhere to be seen. My fingers hovered over the handle. I told myself it was just a faulty latch. Things shift. Metal contracts in the cold. But my pulse was hammering so hard my hands were shaking. Finally, I pulled it open. The light inside flickered once, then steadied, illuminating the narrow rows of storage drawers. All of them were closed, except one, the bottom right. It was extended halfway, the stainless steel tray pulled out just far enough that the toe of a bare, pale foot was visible. I swallowed hard. My eyes darted around the room. Silence felt heavier than the cold. There was no reason for that drawer to be open. I knew for a fact Dr. Klein had closed everything the day before. I also knew we hadn't brought in any new arrivals overnight. I pushed the drawer back in, the metal groaning faintly. The foot disappeared, replaced by the sound of the latch clicking into place. I shut the freezer door, forcing myself not to run. Dr. Klein came in minutes later. He took one look at me, then at the door, and said, "You opened it." It wasn't a question. Before I could answer, he stepped past me and checked the latch, twisting it tighter than before. Then, in a low voice that carried more weight than I understood, he said, "Next time, no matter what, you leave it shut." Dr. Klein didn't explain that day. He just moved on with the routine inventory records, making notes like nothing had happened. But I could feel it. Every time we passed near the freezer, his shoulders stiffened slightly, like he was aware of something I wasn't. I told myself I'd drop it, pretend I hadn't seen the open drawer, pretend those taps on the glass hadn't happened. That lasted exactly 2 nights. I was halfway through my shift, sorting pathology slides, when Klein appeared in the doorway. He didn't have his usual clipped professional tone. He just said, "Come with me." We walked down the hall in silence, his footsteps strangely slow, measured. He stopped in front of the freezer and pulled a small, battered key from his pocket. "I'm going to tell you something," he said quietly, "and then you can decide whether you want to keep working here." I thought he was joking, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, dead serious. "This alarm," he said, tapping the panel on the wall, "doesn't just go off when the temperature changes or the latch is loose. The system's sensitive. If the inside latch is triggered, it sets off the same warning." I frowned. The inside latch? Why would he didn't let me finish? Bodies can shift, rigor passes, air pressure changes. But twice since I started here, we opened that door and found someone. It's not where they were supposed to be. I tried to laugh it off. "You mean like sliding on the tray?" Klein's jaw flexed. "No, I mean out of the tray." The way he said it, calm, almost clinical, made my skin crawl worse than if he'd shouted. I started to ask if he was implying someone had been alive, but he cut me off again. They weren't, and there was no sign of how they'd moved. But the latch was triggered from the inside. 2 weeks later, I was on freezer duty alone. Klein had left early for a meeting across campus, and the security guard on rotation was outside smoking. It was quiet, too quiet for a morgue. Usually there was the hum of the ventilation, a faint rattle in the ducts. That day it felt like the air had been muffled, thickened somehow. I was halfway through a temperature check when the alarm shrieked. Not the soft beep from before this, was a piercing, full-volume wail that echoed in the tiled corridor. Red light strobed against the white walls. I froze, clipboard still in my hand. The freezer door stood closed, the latch in place. My training told me to verify the reading and reset the system. But my brain had already jumped to Kleine's voice. If the inside latch is triggered... I stepped closer. The metal door was vibrating just faintly, but enough that my fingertips felt it. Not the kind of shake from machinery. Something was tapping. I couldn't make myself open it at first. I just stood there staring at the latch, feeling each dull thunk reverberate through the steel. Then the tapping stopped. I heard it clear as anything 3 slow knocks, spaced out like someone counting. I fumbled the key into the lock and yanked it open. The inside light flicked on automatically, revealing row after row of trays. Everything looked still, silent, except drawer 14 was extended halfway out, sheet-covered form lying at an odd angle, as if whoever was under it had tried to sit up before collapsing again. My first thought wasn't ghost. It was, did they miscall a time of death? Did someone actually get put in here alive? I reached for the sheet. That's when the inside latch clicked back into place right in front of me. I yanked the sheet down in one motion. The face staring up at me was gray, waxy, and sunken, mistakably lifeless. A middle-aged man, jaw slack, a suture line running from collarbone to sternum. I recognized him from the intake logs. There was no way he had moved that drawer himself. But the way his body was positioned, it wasn't how we left him. I was certain of it. His shoulders were twisted slightly, one elbow bent, as if he tried to brace himself. I reached for the clipboard, flipping to his record cause of death. Cardiac arrest. Time of death was solid, no mix-ups. Then I noticed something else. The inside of the drawer where the latch mechanism was had a fresh smear of blood on it. Bright red, not the dark, dried kind we saw after autopsies. It wasn't from any incision. It was from his fingertips. The alarm was still blaring, so I stepped back to reset it. But before I turned the key, I caught sight of movement in the far corner of the freezer. It was the dangling strap of an ID badge, swaying like someone had just brushed past it. Problem was Klein was the only other one with clearance in here, and he was across campus. I reset the alarm and slammed the door shut, heart hammering. When Klein returned, we combed through the security footage. Every hallway camera was working fine, until you got to the one pointed directly at the freezer door. For the exact 3 minutes the alarm was triggered, the feed was nothing but static. We called facilities to check the camera logs, hoping it was just a glitch from an electrical surge. The tech on duty pulled the backup files from the server, frowning as he worked. Strange, he said finally, turning the monitor so he could see. The static wasn't just the freezer feed, it's like someone manually disabled the recording for that camera only. Remote override. Who could do that? I asked. Only someone with access credentials, he replied. But that list is short, real short. Klein and I exchanged a look. Neither of us had touched the security system. That left 2 possibilities. An inside job or a breach. We pulled the door log from the freezer. Every opening and closing was time-stamped. Sure enough, the door had been unlocked from the outside at 11:03 a.m., the exact time the alarm triggered. The kicker? The log didn't show my keycard or Klein's being used. It showed a card belonging to Dr. Stephen Hartman. Hartman had been dead for 7 months. I sat there staring at the screen, my brain fighting the easy explanation. The hospital's security system was old. Sure, cards could be cloned. Someone could have found his ID, spoofed the number, and gotten in. But that still didn't explain the bloody fingerprint smears inside the drawer. When I went back later, the drawer was spotless. No smears, no trace. The cleaning crew swore they hadn't touched it. Klein stopped talking about it after that. Me, I kept thinking about that moment I pulled the sheet back. The man's elbow bent, like he'd been pushing on the door from the inside. I decided if Hartman or whoever was using his login was coming back, I wanted proof nobody could erase. The next night I smuggled in a small motion-activated camera I'd bought online. I hid it in the vent above the freezer, angled so it caught both the door and the entire aisle of drawers. It wasn't tied to the hospital's system, just a memory card tucked inside. For the first 3 hours, nothing. I kept myself busy logging in specimens and trying not to jump at every creak from the refrigeration unit. Then, at 1:53 a.m., the temperature alarm went off. The same sharp metallic beeping as before. I made myself move slow, pretending to be irritated rather than afraid. By the time I got to the freezer, it was cracked open 2 inches. A shadow shifted inside the narrow opening. Someone was in there. I stepped back into the prep room, heart hammering, and peeked through the gap. The figure stepped out, the same one from before. Tall, in dark scrubs, face obscured by a surgical mask. They closed the door quietly, like they didn't want even the latch to echo. This time they went straight to the corner where the gurneys were stored. I couldn't see what they were doing, but I heard the faint sound of something tearing plastic. Maybe. Then the rolling squeak of a gurney wheel turning. When they left, they didn't take anything with them. The next morning, I retrieved the camera. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The footage was crystal clear, better than I expected. Only when I hit play, the figure was there, stepping out of the freezer exactly as I saw. But their reflection on the metal drawer fronts was wrong. The reflection showed them holding something in their hand, a long, clear bag with something heavy inside, while in the actual footage, their hands were empty. I froze with my finger hovering over the trackpad, staring at the reflection in that warped sheet of steel. The bag looked awkward, sagging in the middle, the way an object with weight but no structure would droop. And even though the reflection was distorted, I could make out shapes inside, pale, bent, and jointed like. Limbs, not whole, not clean. Pieces. My first instinct was to tell Hartman. But if it was him in the footage, or someone with access through him, there was no way I could trust that conversation to stay quiet. If this person was already moving things around in the morgue undetected, I was just another variable they could erase. Instead, I copied the video to my phone, deleted the card, and tucked the camera back into my bag. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment felt like footsteps in the hall. I kept replaying that reflection in my mind, the faint swing of that bag, and wondering why would someone take part of a body out of the freezer in the middle of the night and then put it back? The next shift, I went into the freezer during my break. Drawer C14, the one I'd seen them linger over before, was heavier than the others. I slid it open a few inches. Inside was a black body bag, but halfway down the length of it, the zipper stopped. The lower section of the bag where legs should have been was completely empty. When I slid the drawer closed again, the temperature alarm behind me chirped once, a tiny mechanical hiccup, even though the door was shut tight. I didn't know if it was a glitch or a warning. I froze with my finger hovering over the trackpad, staring at the reflection in that warped sheet of steel. The bag looked awkward, sagging in the middle, the way an object with weight but no structure would droop. And even though the reflection was distorted, I could make out shapes inside, pale, bent, and jointed like. Limbs, not whole, not clean. Pieces. My first instinct was to tell Hartman. But if it was him in the footage or someone with access through him, there was no way I could trust that conversation to stay quiet. If this person was already moving things around in the morgue undetected, I was just another variable they could erase. Instead, I copied the video to my phone, deleted the card, and tucked the camera back into my bag. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment felt like footsteps in the hall. I kept replaying that reflection in my mind, the faint swing of that bag, and wondering why would someone take part of a body out of the freezer in the middle of the night and then put it back. The next shift, I went into the freezer during my break. Drawer C14, the one I'd seen them linger over before, was heavier than the others. I slid it open a few inches. Inside was a black body bag, but halfway down the length of it, the zipper stopped. The lower section of the bag where legs should have been was completely empty. When I slid the drawer closed again, the temperature alarm behind me chirped once, a tiny mechanical hiccup, even though the door was shut tight. I didn't know if it was a glitch or a warning. The chirp echoed in the still air, sharp enough to make me jerk my head toward the control panel. Nothing was flashing. No alarm, no warning, just silence again, so complete it made me question whether I'd imagined it. I stepped out of the freezer, pulling the heavy door shut until the latch clicked. My hands were damp, but not from the cold. This was sweat, slick with the knowledge that I was standing inside a place where someone was already breaking the rules in the worst possible way. As I turned toward the workroom, I stopped. Hartman was standing there, He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, looking at me the way a parent looks at a kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Except his expression wasn't angry, it was curious. Too curious. "Something wrong in there?" he asked. I swallowed. "No, just checking the seals on the drawers. Thought I heard a blip on the panel earlier." He tilted his head slightly, almost like he was trying to read my pupils. I didn't hear anything. A small smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. But it was in warm it was the kind of smile someone gives when they already know the answer to a question, the Haven Tea asked. Yet, for a second, I thought about just walking past him, going back to my desk, pretending this was nothing. But the weight of the video on my phone in my pocket felt like a burning coal. If he suspected I knew, this wasn't just about an internship anymore. "Everything's fine," I lied, pushing past him. But as I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back, and I knew without seeing that he'd be watching me more closely from now on. I didn't touch my phone for the rest of the shift. Every muscle in my body itched to check that the file was still there, to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But pulling it out with Hartman nearby felt like handing him an invitation to confiscate it. Instead, I busied myself with paperwork sign-in logs, Chinov custody forms, temperature records for each cooler unit, anything that would keep my eyes down and my hands occupied. The clock on the wall crawled toward the end of my shift. Hartman didn't leave the workroom once. Wasn't actually working either. He just stayed in that same loose stance, leaning on the counter, occasionally flipping a page in a file, but never really reading it. Every time I looked up, his gaze was there, maybe not directly on me, but hovering close enough to feel it. By the time the wall clock ticked to 3:59 p.m., my shoulders ached from tension. I signed out on the sheet, slipped my backpack on, and told him I'd see him tomorrow. He gave me a slow nod, eyes unreadable. The air outside felt hotter than it should for late afternoon, or maybe that was just the adrenaline burning through me. I didn't pull my phone out until I was 2 blocks away, turning down a side street where I could stand behind a parked van. The video was still there. I tapped it open, heart pounding, and watched those 3 seconds again. Drawer handle lifting, metal sliding, a glimpse of skin where skin shouldn't be moving. I saved it twice, once to the cloud, once to an encrypted folder, and then thought about who could even see this without it coming back to me. Cops, a news station, someone at the medical board. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. A shadow fell over me. "You left in a hurry today," a voice said behind me. "Hartman." I froze, the screen still lit in my palm. I spun around, phone clutched like a weapon. Hartman was standing there, casual, but his presence carried that same impossible weight as in the morgue. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said softly, eyes scanning the screen in my hand. It's nothing," I stammered, fumbling to lock the phone. He shook his head slowly. "You think you're clever, keeping secrets? But some things can't just be recorded and taken away." I swallowed, the adrenaline and fear making my limbs heavy. I didn't mean. His gaze pierced through me. "Not here to hurt you, yet. But no, the freezer isn't just metal and ice. You saw what it can do when rules are broken, and rules are serious." I nodded mutely. Hartman stepped back, fading into the shadows of the side street. My fingers trembled as I checked the phone one last time. The file was still there, untouched, but I knew he could have deleted it remotely if he wanted. I walked the rest of the way home in a daze, mind replaying the image of that partially opened drawer, the pale figure and the blood smears that had disappeared. From that day forward, I never went near the freezer alone again. Video stayed encrypted, and I never told anyone what I'd seen except for myself. Sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint click of the inside latch from miles away. A reminder that some doors once opened are never truly closed. I've always loved being alone in the early mornings before the world wakes up. There's something about that quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes the air feel sharper and colder, that makes every breath taste like frost and possibility. That's why I became a nature photographer. Not for the pay, which was modest at best, but for mornings like this, the chance to stand somewhere untouched and watch the world reveal itself slowly, without interruption. This morning I was assigned to a water basin deep in the forest, a place so remote that even the locals rarely wandered in. The drive-in was long, the gravel road bouncing beneath my tires, flanked by tall pines that leaned over the path like silent sentries. When I finally arrived, the sky was still painted in dusky shades of gray and gold. The first light seeping through the mist that hovered above the water, I stepped out of my car, boots crunching on the damp gravel, and felt that familiar thrill of solitude wash over me. I set up near a small rise overlooking the basin. The mist curled and twisted over the water, glimmering as though the surface were alive. Ducks floated lazily across the glassy water, their soft quacks muffled by the fog. I crouched behind my tripod, adjusting the lens, framing a shot that would have been perfect for the morning light. Every detail felt sharp, vivid, the rustle of reeds in the breeze, the subtle shimmer on the water, the faint cry of a distant bird. Then it happened. A scream tore through the forest. High, raw, and impossibly human. My heart stopped. I froze mid-adjustment, eyes scanning every shadow, every patch of mist, searching for a sign of who or what had screamed. My stomach twisted as adrenaline surged. I had heard distressed animals before, of course, but this wasn't them. No animal makes a sound like that. This was pure human terror, a scream that reverberated through the trees and chilled me to the bone. I whispered almost to myself, "Hello?" My voice sounded tiny in the massive silence of the forest. There was no reply, only the faint rustling of leaves in the mist. My mind spun with possibilities, none of them comforting. Another scream cut across the basin, closer this time, more desperate. I felt the scream press against me, a physical weight that made my chest tighten and my knees wobble. My hands shook as I grabbed my camera bag, slinging it across my shoulder, and took tentative steps toward the sound. Each step through the underbrush seemed unnaturally loud, twigs snapping beneath my boots, leaves brushing against my jacket. My pulse hammered in my ears as I forced myself to keep moving, calling out, "Is anyone there?" No answer. The scream had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it made the forest feel alive, watching. I pushed through another line of trees and finally stepped into a small clearing at the edge of the basin. And there she was. She was lying on the damp ground, small and frail-looking, her dark hair matted across the moss and leaves. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, her mouth still shaped into that same scream I had just heard. A dark, sticky pool of blood had seeped around her, soaking into the earth. My stomach lurched, bile rising, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root. I dropped my camera bag and fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I almost couldn't unlock it. 911. I gasped when someone finally answered. "There's a woman, she's dead at the water basin." My words came out in staccato bursts, like my brain couldn't keep up with my fear. "Sir, calm down. Can you tell me your location?" the operator asked, voice steady and measured, almost unnervingly calm against the chaos inside me. I rattled off the directions, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering. I think she's been murdered," I added, more to myself than to the operator. My eyes kept darting around the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement, any clue of what had happened. Any hint of the person who might have done this. "Stay on the line. Officers are on the way. Can you stay where you are?" I swallowed hard and nodded even though they couldn't see me. I think so," I said, my voice cracking. I don't know if someone else is here." The forest seemed to lean in around me, heavy and oppressive. The mist curled over the water, and I kept imagining shadows moving through the trees, imagining a figure watching me from somewhere just out of sight. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of my jacket, wishing I had thought to bring a flashlight, wishing I'd never been alone. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the misty forest. Blue and red lights cut through the fog, reflecting on the wet leaves and water. I led the officers to the clearing, trying to explain everything between gasps for breath. I heard the scream, and then, "I found her here," I said. "I didn't touch her. I didn't do anything, I swear." They cordoned off the area, taking notes and photographs, asking me a million questions that I could barely answer. The coroner arrived, confirming what I already feared: the woman had been murdered. But there were no obvious signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the scene, no clue as to who she was or how she ended up there. I sat in my car afterward, shaking, staring at the forest that seemed to have swallowed everything back into silence. The mist still hung over the water, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I couldn't stop picturing her eyes, wide and frozen in terror, and hearing that scream echo in my mind. Even now, when I return to the woods for work, I can't shake the memory. Sometimes I hear it again, faint, carried on the wind, the the scream of a person in danger, desperate and real. It's like the forest is holding on to it, and it follows me, a shadow behind every bird call, every ripple in the water. After that morning, I couldn't bring myself to return to the basin for a week. Every time I drove past the gravel road leading into the forest, my hands would tighten around the steering wheel, my chest constricting like I was driving straight into the scream again. Work was waiting, though, and I had deadlines for the conservation project. Eventually, I forced myself to go back, hoping that maybe seeing the basin empty and quiet would help me reclaim the sense of peace I did once felt there. I arrived just before dawn, mist curling over the water as it always did, but this time it felt differentimus, almost watchful. I parked my car at the same edge of the path, heart hammering, and tried to steady myself. The forest had a new weight, one that pressed against my ribs and made every sound bird calls. Wind through the pines, even the crunch of my boot seam amplified, threatening. I set up my tripod at the rise overlooking the basin, trying to force my hands to stop trembling. I focused on the surface of the water, hoping to lose myself in the reflection of the trees, the mist, the golden light creeping across the surface. I reminded myself she was gone. The police had taken over, investigated, and yet nothing had made sense. The scream, the frozen eyes, the blood on the ground, it all felt like a nightmare that had leaked into reality. And then I heard it again. Not the scream this time, but a rustling behind me, faint but deliberate. I froze, muscles rigid, every nerve on edge. "Hello?" I called out, voice barely more than a whisper. No response. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, mist hiding everything beyond a few yards. My pulse raced, thoughts spinning with every possibility, animal, hiker, someone following me. I picked up my camera, scanning the trees, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But deep down I knew it wasn't. That sound carried purpose, intent. I could feel eyes on me, like the forest itself was alive and watching, waiting. I spent hours at the basin that day, taking pictures of nothing in particular, avoiding movement or sounds that might draw attention. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear a scream, yet when I packed up to leave, my stomach still twisted, my hands still shook. The image of her lying in the clearing haunted me, seared into my mind, impossible to forget. Driving home, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, imagining shadows moving among the trees, imagining that scream returning, following me down the empty gravel road. Every time I close my eyes, even now, I hear it the echo of terror, the sound of someone in real danger, carried on the wind through the pines. And I wonder, was it really a scream that day? Or had I stumbled into something no one was ever meant to witness? I couldn't stop thinking about her. The image of her frozen in terror, the pool of blood spreading into the moss, it was all I could see when my eyes closed. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd been hurt by someone she knew. Maybe it was a tragic accident, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That scream wasn't accidental, was deliberate, a sound meant to terrorize, and it was still echoing in my mind even days later. I started returning to the basin more often, ostensibly for work, but in reality, I was drawn there by something I couldn't explain. Each time, I took slightly different paths, scanning the forest, listening for anything unusual. At first, I told myself I was being cautious, keeping an eye out for wildlife. But as the weeks went on, I realized I was searching for answers, for signs, for closure. One early morning, I caught movement near the edge of the water, a shadow slipping between trees. My heart raced. I raised my camera, pretending to frame a shot, but my hands were shaking too badly to focus. The shadow paused, as if it had noticed me. I froze, holding my breath, and then it vanished. No sound, no trace, just a sudden emptiness where the figure had been. After that, the fear started creeping into everything I did. At home, I double-locked doors and windows, checked the backyard for signs of intrusion, and left lights on at night. I stopped taking photos in certain areas of the forest, avoiding places where the mist hung thick, or where shadows pooled in unnatural ways. Even my dreams were haunted by her scream, repeating over and over, until I would wake up drenched in sweat. Heart pounding, convinced I had seen the clearing again. I received a call from the local police. It found her belongings further downstream from the basin, items that hadn't been there before. A scarf, a pair of shoes, a notebook. It was as if the forest had kept pieces of her, holding them in secret until someone noticed. I couldn't tell if it was a cruel joke or an attempt at closure, but the discovery reignited the obsession. I started documenting everything: tracks, sounds, anything that seemed unusual. Each visit to the basin became a test of my own nerves. I'd walk slowly along the edge of the water, listening, camera ready, imagining that scream returning, imagining someone or something watching me as intently as I watched the forest. The beauty I had once loved now felt dangerous, deceptive. Every glimmer on the water could be a reflection or a warning. Every rustle of leaves could be life or death just out of sight. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself caught between obsession and fear. The forest no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a place of vigilance. Every rustle and shadow a potential threat. I started keeping a notebook, logging the time of day, weather, and any unusual sounds I heard. The misty mornings were the worst. They were the only times I felt the echo of that scream returning, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind, curling around the trees, slipping through the reeds like a ghost that refused to leave. One morning, I arrived earlier than usual, before dawn, and set up at the edge of the basin. I was freezing, my breath forming clouds in the cold air, but I forced myself to stay put. I noticed tracks in the soft soil, human footprints, partially washed by the dew and rain. My stomach dropped. They weren't mine. Someone had been here, moving quietly, deliberately, and I hadn't heard a thing. I followed the tracks cautiously, trying to stay downwind, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever had been near the clearing. The tracks led toward a section of the forest I hadn't explored before, a narrow corridor between thick pines and fallen logs. I hesitated, heart hammering, but curiosity pushed me forward. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper or a warning. Then I heard it again. Not a scream this time, but a soft, wet sound, like someone dragging something across the forest floor. I froze, eyes scanning, muscles tense. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe an animal had fallen or a branch had broken. But the silence didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate. I reached the small clearing where I had first seen her. It was empty, yet something had changed. The earth seemed disturbed, the moss pressed flat in places it hadn't been before. I knelt down, examining the ground, and my stomach twisted. There were new marks, faint scratches. And something else, tiny fragments of clothing, fibers that looked too fine and delicate to belong to anything wild. My hands shook violently as I picked them up, bagging them carefully. I couldn't stop staring at the ground, imagining what had happened here after I left. The rest of the day passed in a haze of adrenaline and dread. Back at my car, I sat, shivering, staring at the mist hanging over the basin. I wanted to leave, to never return, but something held me there. Need to understand, to see, to know why that scream had echoed through my life. That night I barely slept. Every shadow in my bedroom, every creak of the old house, felt like it belonged to her, to the thing that had killed her. The next morning, I returned to the basin earlier than ever, before the sun had fully broken through the trees. The mist clung to the water like a living thing, curling and twisting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I set up my tripod and camera, aiming to document everything: the water, the reeds, the edges of the clearing, even the faint path the killer had taken. I wanted evidence, or at least proof that something had happened. Proof that the scream wasn't just my imagination running wild. Hours passed. The forest was eerily still, save for the occasional bird or insect. Every shadow seemed to flicker with life. I kept scanning, adjusting my lens, focusing on a single reed, then the water's edge, then the trees beyond. Then I saw a faint movement near the edge of the clearing. Quick, deliberate. My heart jumped. I raised the camera, hands trembling, but the movement stopped. There was nothing there now, only mist curling across the forest floor. I whispered under my breath, "Who's there?" My voice sounded too loud, too harsh, too human against the delicate quiet of the forest. I strained to hear a response, but all that greeted me was the soft lapping of water against the basin's edge. And yet, the feeling persisted, the sense that I was being watched, studied, that someone knew I was here and was waiting. I walked slowly along the path, every step measured, careful. I kept my camera up, taking photos of anything that moved, anything that seemed unusual. And then I heard it again. A faint rustle, like someone stepping over fallen branches, soft and cautious, coming from the same direction as before. My pulse quickened. I could see the mist swirling, the sunlight trying to pierce through, but not enough. Whoever or whatever was out there remained hidden. I crouched behind a fallen log, trying to control my shaking, focusing my lens in the direction of the sound. The rustling stopped. And then, as if the forest itself exhaled, I saw a shadow detach from the trees, tall and deliberate, moving across the clearing toward the water's edge. My heart pounded so violently it hurt. I lifted my camera and snapped a series of photos, each click sounding impossibly loud in the silence. The shadow didn't flinch, didn't run. It simply moved with purpose, and then suddenly it vanished. I exhaled shakily, collapsing onto the mossy ground, my hands covering my face. I didn't know what I'd just seen, if it was human or something else entirely, but I knew one thing. The forest had changed. It wasn't safe, and yet I couldn't stop coming back. Something about the scream, about that clearing, had rooted itself in my mind, refusing to leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scream again, the way it tore through the air like fabric ripping. It wasn't just a sound. It carried weight, anguish, finality. My body would jolt awake as though I'd been dropped into ice water. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the shadow I'd seen, the way it moved. Human. Definitely human. But there had been something wrong. The gait was too stiff, too measured, like it was acting out the idea of walking rather than simply walking. By dawn, I was back at the basin. It was becoming a compulsion. I told myself it was for work. I had deadlines, clients expecting wildlife photos, but really, I was searching. Searching for answers to a question I wasn't even sure I wanted to ask. I set up near the same log as before, a vantage point that allowed me to see both the water's surface and the tree line beyond. I had my camera ready, but I also brought along a small audio recorder. If I couldn't capture proof in photographs, maybe sound would betray the truth. The morning passed quietly, unnervingly so. No screams, no shadows, no rustling.
Yes.
Just the occasional bird darting across the water and the hum of insects in the grass. I tried to distract myself by adjusting my camera, snapping shots of dragonflies resting on reeds, but the tension inside me never loosened. Around noon, the heat pressed heavy against my skin. I leaned back against the log, my eyes drifting closed despite my nerves. That's when I heard something sharp, high-pitched, not a scream this time, but a laugh. A short, clipped laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My eyes snapped open, and I sat upright, clutching the camera. The basin looked the same, empty, sunlit, calm. I scanned the tree line, the reeds, the water. Nothing moved. Then a ripple disturbed the still surface of the basin. It spread slowly, outward, as if something had broken the water's skin in the center. My heart climbed into my throat. I lifted the camera, zoomed in, and froze. Floating in the middle of the water was a shoe, single pale sneaker, its laces untied, spinning lazily with the current. I snapped photos furiously, my hands trembling. The shoe drifted, caught in the reeds near the edge, and there it stayed. Wanted to wade in, grab it, prove to myself it was real, but every instinct screamed at me to stay put. To move into that water would be to cross some invisible line I was sure I'd come back from. So I just sat there watching, until the shoe sank beneath the surface without a sound. I whispered aloud, my voice shaking, "What the hell's happening here?" No one answered. But from the far side of the clearing, just beyond the trees, I thought I saw a figure standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't breathe. I don't think I even blinked. The figure stood just at the edge of the trees, partly hidden by the brush. No movement, no sound, just watching. I raised my camera slowly, trying not to startle it. Through the lens, the distance collapsed, and the figure sharpened into something both more real and less human. It was tall to be anyone I knew around town, and dressed in dark clothing that seemed wrong for the heat. A hood shadowed its face. My finger hovered over the shutter, but I didn't click. My shift always began in the late afternoon, just as the light started to shift. Something about sunlight drifting through greenhouse glass made everything seem softer, almost dreamlike. The university greenhouse perched atop the old natural sciences building always felt like a sanctuary. I loved the quiet thrum of irrigation pumps and the scent of damp earth, even alone. Maybe especially alone. On that spring evening, the rest of campus had emptied out as finals loomed. It was just me beneath rows of fluorescent lamps, headphones tucked in, listening to my usual mix of true crime podcasts. I liked the way those stories sharpened my senses, made my routine repotting, watering, pruning, somehow more vivid and real. Every so often I'd pause in my work and let my gaze drift to the windows. Down below, the city hummed with life. But here, suspended above it all, the silence felt almost sacred. There was something luminous in the way dusk settled against the glass, shadows weaving between tangled leaves. I remember thinking the calm wasn't just peaceful, it felt charged. That day, I stayed extra long, letting tasks stretch out, swept up in the gentle rhythm of soil and leaves. I lost track of time as sunset deepened and shadows grew heavier. It wasn't until the dull ache in my back nagged me out of my trance that I realized the greenhouse was now surrounded by night, and every light from the city below seemed impossibly far away. I gathered my gardening tools slowly, reluctant to disrupt the delicate stillness that clung to the greenhouse. My phone buzzed, a fleeting reminder that I'd lingered past closing time. The silence felt as if it pressed even harder against the glass, every movement louder, sharper than it had been in daylight. Leaving the greenhouse, the corridor beyond was just as empty. My footsteps echoed softly, swallowed by the old walls. The building's age showed in cracked tiles and echoes that seemed to come from nowhere. I pulled my sweater tighter, more from a sudden chill than the spring air. The industrial elevator waited at the far end, its battered steel doors gleaming faintly under a dying fluorescent bulb. I pressed the call button and heard the clunky whir of machinery come to life beneath me. The faint hum, oddly comforting in daylight, now carried something hollow, a distant mechanical groan that made my heart beat a notch faster. As the elevator rattled upward, I found myself staring at the strange little window set into its door. Below, the single bulb in the hallway flickered, casting odd patterns against cinder block. A wash of nervousness slipped over me, unbidden, as if the silence wanted to be heard. The elevator stopped with an abrupt jolt. The doors slid open slowly. I moved to step in, then stopped because through the small square of glass, I saw a pale face staring right at me. For one frozen moment, every thought tangled together. Was this a student left behind? Security? Someone lost? But the hallway behind was pitch dark, and for a breathless second, I couldn't see the rest of their body. It felt impossibly quiet, my own breath loud in my ears. I stumbled back. A rush of adrenaline and chilled air surged through me, the greenhouse. The cityscape beyond vanished behind a wall of instinct. By the time I looked again, blinking and bracing myself, the face in the glass seemed suddenly familiar. The warehouse was never truly quiet, at least not in the way people imagine silence. The soft hum of freezers, the distant click of a settling relay, and the occasional metallic groan from unseen pipes always filled the empty corridors. Working midnight shifts meant navigating a landscape of shapes and shadows. Everything cast in blue from emergency lumens or the stray flicker of a dying bulb. I'd start at 11, letting myself in through the back security gate where the only company was the moths circling the sodium lamp overhead. Inside, aisles of towering shelves loomed like fossilized trees, stacked with boxed gloves and fluid for bags. There was no chatter, no radio, just the mechanical whir and the echo of my own footsteps against slabbed concrete floors. It wasn't fear at first, but a kind of awe sense that so much vital material could sit so lifeless. Bandages, scalpels, machines ordered but never unpacked. Dust sparkled in the beams of my flashlight, settling on crates marked in permanent ink. Sterile, do not open. My duties were routine. inventory, restocking, tracking the constant ebb and flow of syringes, vials, tubing. But the night seemed to breathe. Air itself felt thicker, as if each exhale stirred invisible currents between racks and boxes. Some hours, the only sign of movement was my own reflection, shifting and reshaping in the glass of the medication fridge. In those spaces, time seemed suspended. You could sense 1,000 silent stories pressed into every package and corner. The real eeriness began when the ordinary started to change. Around 2 in the morning, when the warehouse feels most untouched by the world, strange noises began threading through the silence. Thumps from the far end of the back aisles, soft at first like something settling, but then deliberate, like footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. There was no one else on shift, and the security cameras confirmed it. The metal clinks grew closer, mingling with faint whispers of wind sneaking past cracked window seals. But the sounds had an almost human rhythm that made every hair on my neck stand up, every muscle tense. I tried telling myself it was nothing, pipes expanding, rats in the rafters, but the timing never matched the usual creaks and groans I'd grown familiar with. One night, a loud crash shattered the brittle calm. A stack of plastic trays had fallen, though everything around them was untouched, no obvious cause. The echo seemed to stretch into eternity, and as I cautiously approached, a sudden, piercing silence followed, a vacuum that compressed the space around me. My flashlight flickered, then steadied. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and I caught a glimpse of a fleeting shape darting far down the aisles. No matter how fast I moved or called out, the warehouse responded only with emptiness. The isolation molded my senses, making every creak and shift seem amplified, turning routine checks into a performance against unseen observers. Sleep later felt distant, and the idea of returning night after night brimmed with a tension I couldn't quite shake.